So this is the famous passage of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel. So we saw in chapter 10 last week where we actually see a lot more of what happens after the Tower of Babel, because it talks about all the different nations that are going to come out. But the first thing you see in verse 1 there is that the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. So as we're going into this chapter, we haven't got to the point where it's been dispersed to different tongues. So when you're in chapter 10, you see all this, how the nations are throughout the whole earth, according to their languages, according to their tongues. Well, at this point in this chapter, it's kind of backtracking as far as before that happened. And so the whole earth was of one language. Now, remember, it says in Genesis 10, in verse 25, for example, it says, unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. So Peleg, I believe, that's giving us information as far as when this happened. Now, I actually was wrong on my calculations last week, and Brother Luke came up to me and rebuked me openly. No, actually, he just told me, he was asking me how I got it, and immediately when he said that, I actually, one of the numbers was kind of off in my mind when I wrote it down. But it was supposed to be, Eber was 34 years old when he begat Peleg, and I put 43. But the way you read it, when you read through this genealogy in chapter 11, it says the 430th year, and his 430th year, so I was like thinking 43. So anyway, I said 110 years. It was actually 101 years after the flood that Peleg was born. And we also saw that Peleg, it says that he was 30 years old when he begat Reu, and then he lived after he begat Reu 209 years. So that means he lived for 239 years. So, somewhere between 100 years after the flood and, 300 and, 30 something years after the flood. So, but it says in his days, so I don't think it's like right when he died. And so it could have been, when he was begetting his son. So I'd say, somewhere around after 100 years is when this happened. So that shows us that the earth was of one language, one nation. Everybody was all together for over 100 years. At least 101 years. So we see, though, that what do they try to do when they're all together? And this is a great chapter to really show why big cities are not a good idea. Okay? When you see where most of all the crime happens, where most of all the wickedness happens, where people are scrunched together. And you'll say, well, there's more people there. Well, look at the whole U.S. and look at just how everybody's spread out. And if you took all the rural areas and combined them all, you would have a lot more people than what you'd have in those cities. But yet, if you looked at the statistics as far as how much crime and how much wickedness and all that stuff went on, comparing it to that, it'd be a lot more in the cities. And so this is a great example of why we don't want to all be in one place, all together at once. And obviously God didn't want that, because what happens is he foils their plan, right? So when they come together, they're all of one language. They can all understand each other. And this is what everybody's like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we all spoke the same language and if we were all just one nation? And no, that wouldn't be a good thing. The only time that's going to be great is when Jesus is setting up his kingdom. If it's man doing this, you don't want any part of it. And we're going to get into that with the Antichrist, because what we see here in Babylon, or in the very beginning, this is the very first Babylon. This is in Shinar that this is going on. That's where Babylon, the physical Babylon was. And so this is showing us that at the very beginning, after the flood, all the nations were together. It was one nation, one language. I'm sure it was the same currency. I'm sure it was, everything was the same. And notice what they say here in verse 2. It says, and it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And notice what it says in verse 4. It says, and they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of all the earth. Now, what's interesting is, you ever heard of basically someone trying to climb up to heaven or make a ladder to heaven, and there's constantly, this is just a proverbial example of how people are trying to get to heaven by building, working their way to heaven. And isn't that what false religion is? When you think of the fact that false religion compared to the true faith is you got to do good works. The true religion, true faith is the fact that it's just by faith, it's not by works at all. And so as Cain, pictures work salvation, well, this is what this Babylon or this Babel and this tower represents, is salvation outside of God. Now, there's the tallest building in the world today is the Burj Khalifa. So I don't know if you ever looked it up, but it's in Dubai. It used to be called the Burj Dubai. Now it's called Burj Khalifa. And it's 2,717 feet high. Now, to give you some perspective, a mile is 5,280, right? Make sure I got that right. Remember we were asking everybody, Dave didn't know what it was. And Dave Gandy, and we were like, it's 5,280, and then he's like, no one knows that off the top of their head. And he's like, Tabby, how many feet are in a mile? And she's like, 5,280. And he's like, what in the world? So anyway, when I did my civil stuff, when I used to be in the civil realm, I used to know all the conversions. It's like 1,760 yards or something like that. And so I used to know all those conversions. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So what I'm saying with this is the fact that the Burj Khalifa is almost a half a mile high. So that's pretty high. And actually, if you you can watch videos where someone's up there and you're looking down and there's literally skyscrapers and they look like little low-rise buildings compared to it. And so that's pretty tall. And to give the Twin Towers, isn't it interesting? It's called the Twin Towers. We're talking about the Tower of Babel. And so the Twin Towers, just the ones that were, that fell down, by a plane, was 1,368 feet. So they're pretty tall, but the Burj Khalifa is even taller than that. And so, I don't know what they were planning on, how high they were going to get this tower, but they were doing it out of brick and slime, as their mortar. And so, you think about the pyramids, and obviously those are pretty tall, but they're not that tall when you compare it to these buildings that are here today. But I don't know how tall they were planning on taking this thing, but they would have had to have a really big base for this to be. And some people have said they found where they think the footprint of it was, and it was pretty massive. Anyway, it's interesting. So we don't know, because it talks about how when they were beginning to do this, that's when God came in and stopped them. So it's not like this tower was built and then they left it. They left the working of it as they were building this city and this tower. But you also think about the fact that they were in a plain. So they were in a plain is just a flat area, right? But you think about, what's the New Jerusalem going to be on? It's the mountain. It's the holy mountain, And you think about, structurally speaking, that is perfect. Because if you think of a tower, you think of a building, something could take that out. And if it's on a mountain, you're building it upon a mountain, you're building it upon a rock, so to speak. But anyway, the Twin Towers, for example, and all this stuff, they collapsed. And so there was something that could be said about that. But what I was going to get to here. So trying to make sure I don't miss a point here. So the whole point of them being together is they said, let us build us a city and a tower, let us make us a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of all the earth. So there's a reason why they wanted to build this tower and build the city, because they didn't want to be scattered. Okay? Because there's safety in numbers, so to speak. And so when you think about this, why do people congregate? Why do people want to be together? Because they want to be safe, so to speak. They want to be around a lot of people because they feel like they're going to be safe that way. As soon as you go out into the wilderness by yourself, you've lost all comfort of being safe around people. And so I wanted to talk about that for a second, as far as they wanted safety within themselves. They wanted safety outside of God. They wanted safety within man. And so this reminds me of something with Samuel, as far as, or with, how they rejected Samuel as being a judge, or basically they rejected his sons as being judges, and they wanted a king. So go to 1 Samuel chapter 8. I think this kind of represents, the fact that they wanted someone to fight for them. They wanted safety outside of the Lord. And so, and anytime you want safety that's of man, you have to sacrifice liberty. There has to be a sacrifice of liberty if you want the safety of man. So if you want the government to take care of you from cradle to grave, you have to sacrifice liberty. And what Samuel's telling them is that when they say, hey, we want a king to reign over us, that's what Samuel's saying, is saying, hey, he's going to take your sons, he's going to take your daughters, and the daughters are going to be confectionaries, they're going to be, making them cakes and all this stuff, and then the men are going to be all these, the valiant men in his army. And so he's making a point to him that says, hey, you don't want a king because of this. But they wanted a king for a reason. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 5, it says, and said unto him, behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. So the people of Israel are saying, hey, listen, you're old, your sons aren't doing what you were doing, we want a king. Verse 7, it says, and the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people and all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So it wasn't a matter of the fact of the judges not being what they wanted. They rejected God from being their ruler. And so in verse 19, notice the reason why they wanted a king. What was the reason for wanting a king? In 1 Samuel 8, verse 19, it says, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. This is something that comes up throughout the Bible where people want safety, but they want it of men and they don't want it of God, or they don't want to trust in God. And obviously it takes faith to trust in God, but I think of our nation with this, and how our nation has given up their liberties for security. And it's a false sense of security is what that is. So you think of the Twin Towers. And by the way, the Twin Towers, yes, planes crashed into them, but is that really how they fell? How about Building 7 that wasn't hit by a plane? How did it fall? And they'll say, well, fires. You know what? I read the NIST report, and I'm a structural engineer. And when I read the NIST report, what they said with it is, first of all, if you read the NIST report, it doesn't say conclusively that this happened. They said, we believe this is what happened because there was fires in there. They don't know how hot the fire was. They don't know how long necessarily it burned. They don't know how far it went. And what they said was, well, it was built over another building, and there was like this column that was basically it was a column that was kind of resting on the existing building, and when that column came down, then the whole thing came down. You expect me to believe that? You expect me to believe that it's going to fall at free fall speed because one column failed? Show me any other place anywhere that's ever happened. Ever. And so I don't believe it for a second. And even the Twin Towers, when you think about how columns buckle, this is what they told me in school, because this is before I even questioned the official story. But the Twin Towers, what they told me, I was in a concrete design course, and they were trying to explain why they believe it happened. So what they said is that if one of the floors fell out, for example, well, now your columns are twice the length of what they were designed for. So it makes sense, like you're thinking, okay, they would buckle a little more. But again, when you think of buckling, it's not as simple as like black and white, this is how it falls. It never buckles the same. The theory of column buckling today is still something that's very studied into, and you have to use finite element design to even try to figure out how it works. And even if you're doing that, it's not always going to work. There's so much imperfections in the steel and imperfections in the shapes that you don't know which way it's going to buckle. But somehow it fell into its footprint. A building that was 1,300 some feet high fell into its footprint. I mean, heck with the demolition and how much that costs. Just throw some planes into the building and then just demolish them that way. And so 9/11, why do I bring that up? Because 9/11, you know, whoever you think did it and whatever happened, you know, that's irrelevant. Because when 9/11 happened, they passed the Patriot Act, which just basically signed away the liberties of America. And America was all for it because they were afraid. They were afraid of some foreign invader. They were afraid for their lives. And all they said is, government, please take care of us. You know, whatever it takes. I have nothing to hide. You can basically just search me without a warrant. And that's what the Patriot Act was. Later on, they signed the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, into place. And that's just stripping us of our liberties. What was it for? For safety. It was for safety. They already had it drafted up, by the way. They didn't just write that up after 9/11 happened. They had it drafted up. And is it a big coincidence that was pushed in right after that event? Well, that's never happened before. Look at history. When they've done false flags. When they've killed innocent people in order to get their agenda out, to get stuff passed through Congress. You know, pulling at people's emotions is always the best way to work. And so that was when all America was on their knees. And some of you younger kids don't know what we're talking about because it was back in 2001. But I was in high school when this happened. And obviously, you know, when it happened, I was like, it did kind of jar you. Like, you didn't think that would happen. You wouldn't think that there'd be an outside invader that would do that. But then when you learn about Building 7 and how it fell, and then you're like, now you're shaking, you're like, the government? Because how else would that fall? Besides it being a controlled demolition. And so I've heard people talk about, like, the shock waves of the other two towers falling is what caused it to fall and all this stuff. Give me a break. Show me the calculations on that one. Show me the calculations on that. They're always like, I'm a demolition. Yeah, sure you are. Sure you are. And so, but when I read the NIST report, I mean, you would laugh at it. I mean, even someone that's not an engineer could read that report and be like, and this is what the official story is. Nothing is verified in there, and all they say in there is that this is what we believe is what happened. They had some models to try to show it. And I'd like to see that model that would show that thing falling at free fall speed because one column failed. One column. Give me a break. And so, anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent, but 9/11 and the government taking care of every single person is exactly what's happening in our country. And so you can see how they're going to try to bring in this one world government. Because in Babylon, or in Babel, when they were building this tower, why did they want to build this tower? Because they didn't want to be scattered. They wanted to be all together. And so, how are they going to get everybody to come together in the world? Well, there's terrorism. There's terrorism, there's bad people out there, bad people with guns. Hey, give us all your guns and we'll take care of you. Give us all your freedoms, we'll take care of you. Why don't you just go to prison? Because that's pretty safe in there. They'll put you in a cell, they'll give you your meals, and you won't have any freedoms, but you have a lot of security. Right? Because isn't that what it comes down to? Is as soon as you start stripping away those freedoms, you have just a prison. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. The Bible says in Proverbs 21, verse 31, it says, the horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord. What we have is a country that has forgotten God. We have a country that doesn't want to recognize God as their authority. They don't want to recognize God as their king. They've rejected God as their king, and they put government as their king. And they did it for security. That's what our country has done it for. For the greater good of security. They want to be safe in the arms of government. The government just wants to eat you. That's what's, I mean, it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. They're like, come, I'll take care of you, and then they eat you. That's government. And so government And here's the thing, the government doesn't do what it's supposed to be doing according to the Bible. The Bible says that it's supposed to execute judgment upon evildoers. It doesn't do that. All it does is persecute the righteous, and then does a whole bunch of stuff it's not supposed to be doing. Like tell me what to eat or drink, or where I can go, when I can go, what license, if I can carry a gun, when I can't carry a gun. And so, but I just want to show you, that is an example. You know, Psalm 20 in verse 7, a very famous verse. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. And so in Babel, I believe they were basically trusting in man. They wanted to trust in man. They wanted to build a tower to heaven. They wanted to have everybody together so they could have security, so they could have safety. Is it a big shock to you that the people in these big cities are a bunch of the biggest pansies that are out in the world, that couldn't take care of their family? If everything just fell to the ground and everything just stopped, they would not be able to take care of their families. They wouldn't be able to do anything for anybody else because they're just in this big environment. They're in their safe spaces, and they're basically cut off from reality. They go into the Hollywood, New York, LA. They all think that they're all, whatever they believe and think and do is what everybody else does. And they're completely detached from reality. And that's where wickedness abounds. That's where homosexuality abounds. That's where most of the wickedness in our country is in New York City, Chicago, in LA, Hollywood, aka Hollywood. That's where most of the wickedness abounds. And obviously there's wickedness throughout our country, but it's where a bunch of people are congregated in the one spot. So we have a bunch of Babylons. We have a bunch of towers of Babel. Is it a big coincidence that most of the big cities have skyscrapers? Is that a big coincidence? That there's a bunch of towers and these little Babels that are in our nation? And so, and here's the thing, you know, I'm not against people living in those cities, you know, trying to win people to Christ. They need to be in the big cities. We need to be in the areas where people are congregated. That's where we need to go to preach the gospel. Okay, so I'm not saying like, hey, you're wicked if you're living in that city, but that's why wickedness abounds in there. But in Genesis chapter 11, God doesn't want this to be. God doesn't want the world to be united in one language with one nation. The Antichrist does. And so in Genesis chapter 11, verse 5, it says, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, all the people is one, and they have all one language. This they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. And they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth." So God didn't want this. He saw that they were all together, and notice he said basically that they won't be constrained to do everything that it says, which they have imagined to do. So God is showing us a point here is that this is going to breed wickedness. This is going to breed rebellion. This is going to breed basically evil imaginations. And so we see it to be true. I mean, this is just like reading a textbook if you were to look at the big cities of the world. That's where all, most wickedness happens. That's where a lot of just filthy stuff is going on, is in big cities. And so it's just not a good environment. God didn't want it to be that way. That's why he gave them different languages. This is where the languages came from. And so if you think about the fact of, where did Hebrew come from? Well, it probably came out of whoever was coming out, where we have the Macedonia or the Chaldees. We're going to get into that a little bit at the end here. But you think about where our languages came from, it stemmed out from there, and God gave them those languages. So you say, well, there's some big differences between these. Well, that's why. So you imagine when they're building this tower, and they're building the city, and all of a sudden, Charles is over here speaking Chinese, I'm speaking German. You're not going to be able to work together like that. And so it just completely segregated everybody based off language. And I don't believe it segregated people off the skin color, okay? At this point, I believe everybody probably looked exactly the same, but when everybody spread out, then the gene pool was kind of basically getting cut off from each other, and you probably have more people that were, looked a certain way and all that stuff. And a lot of that is geographic. Even if you look up, like dark-skinned people, black people, or even Indian people and stuff like that, it's usually dealing with geographics and basically the amount of sun people get. And so this whole idea of, God has made all the nations of one blood. He made of one blood all nations. So everybody here that was at the Tower of Babel that were split up, they all came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Period. And we read where they went, so we saw, where they were scattered to. And so, we're like, well, Ham, he was black man. The mark of Ham, or mark, we were talking about the mark of Cain and how that's dumb anyway. But then they'll say, well, Ham, he was a black man, and he was cursed of God and all this stuff, and you get all these white supremacist morons out there that try to put their stupid crap in the Bible. But here's the thing, Ham was also of Canaan. Ham was of Egypt. So when you look at those people, they're not, and Paul, it says that they thought he was an Egyptian. So this whole idea, were they all Ethiopians? I mean, was Jesus a black man? And so the whole idea, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the skin color. We're talking about languages here that were split up. And so, but anyway, God didn't want that to happen, but this is going to come full circle. So way back when, about 2600 BC is when the flood happened, right? And so, and we're about 2500 or so. If you're saying, right when Peleg was born, this is when this happened, then you're about 2500 BC that all the nations are being dispersed out into different areas. And so this is going to come full circle because there's going to be a one world kingdom, a one world government again, and it's going to be through the Antichrist. So I want to talk about that for a minute because this Babel, what we'll see, because in the end times, what do we have? We have 2 chapters dedicated to Babylon. And so this is an interesting subject because it's coming full circle to where everybody's going to be of one religion, one currency, one government. Everything's going to be pushed together as one, and it's going to be through the Antichrist. But go to Revelation chapter 13. So I kind of want to talk about this beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. I know we kind of talked about it before, but I wanted to go into it again. I wanted to just talk about what the 7 heads represent. And so in Revelation 13, we see the beast for the first time. And I'm not going to go into Daniel and go all of that, but the beasts, there's different types of beasts, and they would represent kingdoms. And you see that in Daniel, where there's 4 beasts in Daniel chapter 7, and then you have also the Medo-Persian is represented by a ram with 2 horns, and then the Grecian Empire is represented by a he-goat. So it's just using animals and different beasts to kind of represent kingdoms. But in this, it says in verse 1, it says, "And I stood upon the sea, or upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." So we see here that this beast comes up out of the sea, and in chapter 12 that we were dealing with Satan himself, the dragon. Well, now he's got his man coming up here, who's coming up out of the sea, and this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, all this represents something. Okay, so when the Antichrist comes, he's not going to look like this. He's not going to be a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, everybody would be like, that's the beast. Okay, no one would be deceived by that. Be like, what's this monster? It's like Godzilla coming out of the ocean or something like that. And now, it's coming after us. So it's not, it represents something. So just as much as in Daniel, when you had the lion with the eagle's wings, and you had the bear, and then you had the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, and then you had the diverse beast. Notice that in this chapter we see that it's a leopard with the feet, right? The feet of the bear, and then the mouth of a lion. So we see that it's coming out. The same kingdoms that were in the past are being spoken of here. Now, go to chapter 17, because chapter 17 actually gives us a lot more information about this beast. And the great whore is sitting upon this beast, and then it starts talking about what this beast is. But in verse 3 there, so Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3, it says, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." So we're talking about that same beast that came up out of the sea, and that's the Antichrist. Now, the beast sometimes can represent the whole kingdom, or it can represent the man himself. Okay? And so sometimes you'll see like the beast, and it's talking about the whole kingdom. But in this case, we're seeing that we're talking about that beast again. He has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now in verse 8, it gives us a lot of information about this beast. In verse 8 it says, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition, and they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is." Now this is explaining a little more detail as far as when in chapter 13, that beast that came out of the sea, it says one of his heads was wounded to death. And it says now that deadly wound was healed, and they all wondered and worshiped the beast. Well, now it's giving you a little more information, because it's no doubt that he dies, because he's coming up out of hell. Okay, so, and obviously this is the Antichrist. So you think about, well, Jesus died and was buried and rose again the 3rd day. So the Antichrist is going to try to duplicate what he did. And so that's why people are wondering. You know, if he just got shot in the head or something like that, people have survived that. So this isn't something like, well, he survived a deadly wound like that. It's saying that he died. Was and is not. Is not in the Bible, when you look that up, was not or is not, it's talking about people died. You know, talk about Rachel weeping for her children because they are not in Matthew chapter 2. There's no doubt that they're talking about the fact that the children are dead because Herod killed them. And so in verse 9 there, notice what it says. It says, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings." So now we're getting a little more information. There's 7 kings. So what's the 7 heads represent? 7 kings. And it says, "5 are fallen, and one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space." Now, when you read this, you may say, well, is this 5 are fallen up to this point in the story of Revelation? But that wouldn't make any sense, because we're going to be talking about how the Antichrist is coming out of this, and we're already in the fact that Babylon's being destroyed in the 7th trumpet and 7th vial, right? So what this means is that he's talking to John, and so we're talking about in John's day, 5 of these kings have already fallen. One is, and one is yet to come. So what we see here is that these kings, these 7 kings, aren't all there at one time. Does that make sense? That this is something that's going throughout history. And so, in reading on there, it says, in verse 11, it says, "And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition." You say, well, how does that make sense? There's 7 heads. Well, he was one of the 7, and he died, and now he's the 8th. Does that make sense? So he was of the 7, but now he's the 8th because he died and came back to life. And so, obviously, it's showing us that his kingdom wasn't that powerful before, and we know that he's going to be killed, and he's going to come back, and now he's going to have full power. But, and it says, notice in verse 12, it says, the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings. So now we have another 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Now these 10 kings are all there at once. Does that make sense? So the 7 heads represent 7 kingdoms that were from the past up to where John is writing the book of Revelation, and then talking about the future. And then these 10 kings, though, these 10 kings are the ones that are going to be there at the end times. So if you look at Daniel talks about 10 toes on that statue, which is the last kingdom that's going to come upon the earth before Christ sets up his kingdom. And then the diverse beast has 10 horns. So the 10 kings are going to be there in the last days. Okay, does that make sense? There's going to be 10 kingdoms, what I believe, because kings and kingdoms can be used interchangeably. It's not always just talking about the one king, but their kingdom as well. So the 10 kingdoms are going to come together and give their kingdom unto the beast. Does that make sense? And so, so they're going to give all their power to him. They're going to have power 1 hour, and then they're going to give him all that power. And so this is where everything's going to be centralized into one government. So you can think about the UN. When we had World War I, after World War I, what did we have? The League of Nations. After World War II, what did we have? The UN, right? The United Nations. So I predict, and now again, I could be completely wrong on this, but I believe there's going to be another world war, because you look at the seals, you see the fact that there's going to be war, and there's going to take peace from the earth. And so there's going to be this world war that happens. And I believe after that, there's going to be this final union of nations, so to speak, where everybody's coming together and saying, hey, we need to stop all this fighting. We need to come together. And they're going to give all their power unto the beast. Does that make sense? Now, you may say, well, who are these 7 heads? Okay. Well, we know that from where John was at, he was in the 6th king. Right? 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. So the 1 was during John's time when he was alive. Well, what was the main kingdom? Rome, right? The Roman Empire. No, I mean, I don't think you could ever doubt that, because Jesus, obviously, the Romans were, I mean, throughout the Gospels, you see that the Romans were in control of Jerusalem. And the Romans were, the power that was there. They couldn't put anybody to death, but by, permission by the Romans. And so Rome was that power. So you can just backtrack in history as far as what's going on. But think about this. When we get, next week, when we get into chapter 12, what's the first kingdom that's mentioned? Egypt. Egypt is that first power after Babel. Now, Babel obviously was like everybody was together, and that was like a world power, so to speak. But there wasn't any other nations, Basically, they were all just together because they all came off the ark together. So it's basically just like a big family that hasn't split up yet. Over 100 years, they're just all still together. Then they split up, and now we have Egypt, who is the first big power, and that Egypt lasts as a big power for a while. Because you think of Egypt, even when you get into the kings of Israel, Egypt, they're still kind of going to Egypt for help. Right? And Egypt was never really the same after Moses. After the Red Sea and all that stuff, you don't really see them as being a huge power or force after that. But I believe Assyria is the second one. Now, the one big reason why I believe Assyria is the second one is because if you just read chronologically through the stories of the kings, Assyria is the big power that was taking out the northern kingdom of Israel, and they were trying to come after Judah, but God, fought them off. But then Babylon took over. So Assyria, and also Nineveh, is very strongly parallel to Babylon. Now, Nineveh is the capital city of Assyria, and we even saw Assyria mentioned, or Nineveh mentioned in chapter 10. So Nineveh is a very old city, right? And so Nineveh is mentioned, Babylon's mentioned, and we saw that Egypt was of Ham, so we knew that Egypt was in there. And Egypt's mentioned in the next chapter. In chapter 12, Egypt's brought up. So we know that Egypt's a very, very beginning kingdom. And so Assyria, I believe, is a very strong fact that that's in there. That one, I think, is probably the harder one to really prove, distinctly that it is. I don't think anybody would dispute Egypt, right? But Assyria, I believe, is pretty easy because Nineveh, if you look up, Nineveh is called the Great City, talks about their witchcrafts and all this other stuff that's like parallel perfectly with Babylon being destroyed in Revelation. Well, Babylon, now, there's 4 that we know for sure. Or there's at least 3 that we know for sure, because when you're in Daniel, you have Babylon. You had that statue, the head was Babylon. And then you had the Medo-Persians, and then you had the Grecians. So in Daniel, you have 3 kingdoms that are for sure a progression of kingdoms, right? And so those 3 are definitely in there. And we already said that Rome was 1, so that gets you up to 6. Right? So the only ones that you're really guessing at is Egypt and Assyria, the first 2. Does that make sense? But you can just backtrack and say, well, Greece and the Persians, and then go back to Babylon, and then who was before that? So you have 2 that you'd have to say, okay, well, who are these other 2? It's not that super important, but you can definitely see where that fits. when you're just reading your Old Testament and just reading what kingdoms were in power at those times. So in Revelation chapter 30, go back to Revelation chapter 13, talking about the Antichrist, it's all coming full circle, because in the end times, we're going to be all coming back to this one world government where everybody's together, and we're going to have a one government, one religion, one currency. And it's all in Revelation 13. Revelation 13 gives us all of that. And so, Revelation 13, it says in verse 7, Revelation 13, verse 7, it says, "And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations." Sometimes you read stuff a little faster than you probably should, but it says all kindreds and tongues and nations. That's all of them. I mean, that means that he has power over every single nation in the world. So there's your one world government. Go down to verse 15. In verse 15, and it says, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed." There's your one world religion. That if you don't worship this beast's image, this Antichrist's image, then you're going to be killed. So there's your one world religion. And in verse 16 it says, "And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand and in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name." So we see here, now we have a one world currency. You can't buy or sell without this mark. So just everything's controlled and it's centralized into one spot, one man, one kingdom. It's all coming full circle. God didn't want it to be that way, but it's always been trying to get back there. Think about all these kingdoms. They're always wanting to be a world power. And obviously I believe that America right now, if it happens in our lifetime, America is a Babylon right now. America is a world power. And I don't have cable, I don't see these commercials anymore, but I remember used to seeing these commercials where it's like for the Navy or the Army, and it says, "We're a global power for good," or something to that along those lines. A world power, global power for good. That's literally their motto. Like, I don't know if it was Navy or Army, I think it was the Navy was saying that. And so they recognize that. They're saying it openly, that America is a world power. For good, though. Right? So, yeah. So anyway, the America, you can definitely see fitting the bill as far as this last kingdom. So that shows you, think about that as far as being the last days, and the fact that 5 are fallen, 1 is in John's day, and 1 is yet to come. And obviously there was kingdoms that were going on throughout that. You think of the Ottoman Empire, and you think about the English empires and all that stuff. And obviously we came out of England, and we became a nation after that. And so there's definitely been other powers, other stuff going on. But in the end, we're going to have this world power where everybody's together, everybody's centralized. And so it's going to be kind of like the Roman Empire or Babylon in that aspect, as far as just this world power and one person in charge. Now, we were talking about the Tower of Babel. All of it's going to fall. And so that Tower of Babel, if they would have built it, God could have taken it down like that. Now what's interesting is that when I design a building, you design the building to just take like loads as far as just like what we would call a gravity load. Okay? Unless you're a flat earther and then you don't believe in gravity. But so you have a gravity load, and so basically you're just designing stuff that goes down, right? I'm just trying to make it simple. Like if you put like this thing on a beam, it's just holding the weight of it, right? Well, there's another part that you have to look at is what we would call a lateral load. Okay? Now, a lateral load are basically two simple things that you think about. You think about wind, and you think about seismic or earthquake load. Okay? So if you're out in California, you're usually looking at earthquake more than anything else, right? Here, seismic doesn't control most of the time. Usually wind controls. Okay? And so it depends where you live at. If you live on the coast, you're going to have a lot of wind. If you live in an area where it's high seismic areas, you're going to have to deal with a lot of seismic issues. And so what's interesting about this, though, they were building it out of brick. And slime is their mortar. And if you know anything about that, buildings that are just stacked up stone do horrible in earthquakes. Horrible. They just can't handle it. And so what's interesting about, and this is interesting to me, but when you design a building, if I were designing it for wind, you want the building to be really heavy. Okay? You want the building to be heavy because the heavier it is, the more weight it has to hold it back from being pushed over. Does that make sense? If you're designing for seismic, you want it to be light. Because the more weight that the more weight the building has, the more load is applied to it. Because you think about if you were to like try to, if something was on top of here and you're moving it from the bottom, the more weight that's on there, the more it moves, the more weight's going to be out of balance, and it's going to be trying to tip it over. So and I know I'm not explaining this perfectly, but what I'm saying is that that's what's interesting, is that it's a lose-lose situation. You could say, well, I want this building to be really heavy. You know, it helps you with wind, not seismic. And you say, well, I want it to be really light. Well, you know, that helps you with seismic, but not wind. Now, in the end times, there's going to be a lot of earthquakes. And so and all these buildings are going to fall. And I don't care how heavy you make it. I don't care how light you make it. It's coming down. And so go to Revelation chapter 11. Revelation chapter 11. There's your structural engineering lesson for the day as far as seismic and wind loading. But every time I think about them building that tower, I'm thinking God could take that thing out like that. Just one little earthquake, that thing's done. And so that's why when you see like in Haiti and like you see other these places that they have an earthquake and everything's just demolished, it's because they're just stacked stones. And you know, they don't have any codes. They're not using reinforcing, all this other stuff. And so in America, obviously, you don't see as much catastrophe when it comes to earthquakes because we're designing for it. But here's the thing, you only design so far. I don't design buildings here in West Virginia for the seismic level of Mount Kilimanjaro, okay? You know, like I'm not on a volcano like doing seismic, you know, loading on a building. So if anything came here, as far as a seismic or an earthquake that was more than what I designed it for, that building's gonna fall because you only design it so far. And so all these buildings, they're designed to a certain point and God's gonna take them all down. I don't care what they design it to, it's going down. And so the mountains are going away. So you know these buildings are. But in Revelation chapter 11, verse 13, before we get to the finale, going into the finale, he gives a little taste as far as what he's going to do to these buildings. Because Revelation 11, verse 13, it says, in the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell. And the earthquake, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to God, to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe cometh quickly. If you know, this is the sixth trumpet. So right before the seventh trumpet sounds, it says that a 10th part of the city fell. We're talking about Jerusalem because we were talking about where the two witnesses were killed. And so the 10th part of Jerusalem fell because of this earthquake. Well, go to Revelation chapter 16. Revelation chapter 16 and verse 17. Revelation chapter 16, verse 17. Revelation 16, verse 17, it says, and the seventh angel poured out his vial in the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, it is done. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. Now that's intense. It says that it's an earthquake, which is, it says, such as was not since men were upon the earth. You know, you think about tribulation such as the world's never seen. Think about an earthquake that the world's never seen. And there's some been pretty amazing like earthquakes that even in our lifetime as far as what's happened. But notice what it says in verse 19. And it says, and the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. The cities of the nations fell. Think about that. New York falls. Chicago falls. London falls. Berlin falls. You know, like all these different places, Shanghai, Hong Kong, all, you know, Dubai. The Burj Khalifa is going down, okay? God's taking it down. God's going to take down every single city that's on the earth, and he's doing it by an earthquake. And so he could have done it with the Tower of Babel. He didn't even let him get started on it. But you see how he's going to take these towers down. He's going to take these towers of Babel down. And so I don't think a building that high is inherently wrong, okay? But you don't see a high rise in a rural area. The reason you have a high rise is because you're running out of space. Think about it. Why else would you be building something that high? It's because you don't have enough space and you literally have to go up because you can't go out. And so the higher the buildings are, it shows you that it's the more population, the more people are being crammed into a city. And so that's why God said that, he scattered them because of that. And so what do we have? A bunch of cities, a bunch of Babylons, a bunch of Babels with their towers and with all their wickedness to go with it and all their evil imaginations that they won't be restrained of what they want to do. And so, it's just a perfect example of the cities that we have today. It's just like reading the newspaper. When you think about what happened here with Babel, why God didn't want it to happen. And so right after the flood, you think about the fact that he said, I'm not going to flood the earth again. And it's almost like this precaution, like I'm trying to keep them away from doing something stupid, and causing them to go out and spread out. And so you don't have to live off the grid. You don't have to be like Dick Prenneke and go out into Alaska and build a house with your bare hands and live out there by yourself. Okay, I'm not saying that. That's an extreme, case where people do stuff like that. Obviously, we need to be around people. We're going to win people to Christ. We need to be where the people are. Okay, but it does show you why we have a bunch of wickedness in some of these places, and why it's exponential as far as what's going on in these big cities. And so, why do you think all the queers want to go to these big cities? Why do you think that's where the majority of the perverts are at? Do you think that's a coincidence? Or do you think that it's because it breeds it? It breeds wickedness. It breeds violence. And so they go there, and you talk to these people in the city, they go out to the country, they're like, they feel uneasy being out in the country. They feel like they're not around people. And they have safety in the fact that if they were in a city or something like that, there's people around that can help them. Do you see how they're craving safety and security? But they forgot that God is the ultimate safety. And you know what? When you're in the city, you're more likely to get shot than you are out in the country. And so it's a false sense of security is what it is. But they're not trusting in the Lord. Is it a big coincidence that more rural areas are more likely to believe the Bible? Is that a big coincidence? That the bigger cities, you have more atheists and you have more haters of God and you have more people that are against the Bible than out in the rural area. And I know most of these people aren't saved, right? When you go to the Bible Belt and all this stuff, they're not believing in faith alone for salvation, but still they would claim Christian values. They still say, hey, I believe in God. But you go into these big cities, it's not that way. So that's the Tower of Babel. It's coming full circle, my friends. It's coming around to where, it's going to be Babel again. The towers are already being built, so to speak. They've already been built. And so all these big cities. So you think about Babylon, it's basically just going to be a conglomeration of a bunch of people and, wherever that's set up. And so something to look for in the future, and we see it plainly in Scripture. But I just want to end on this with Abraham's father, Terah or Terah, however you want to pronounce it. So at the end of the chapter here, we see in verse 27, it talks about Abraham's dad. And so Abraham here is just Abram, so he doesn't get that name Abraham until later. And same thing with Sarai, her name's changed to Sarah. And so in verse 27, it says, these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. So we see Abraham and Lot here. Lot is Abraham's nephew. So It's the son of his brother, Haran. Now Haran, it says in verse 28, Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. So Haran died before they went to Haran. Okay, so they died in Ur of the Chaldees, but we see, where did they come from? Where was their nativity? The Chaldees. So where was Babel? It was in Shinar. Where was the Chaldees? In the land of Shinar. That's where Babylon is at, or where it was anyway. And so in verse 29 it says, and Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren; she had no child. So obviously we know the story of Sarah and how she didn't have Isaac until she was 90 years old. Abraham was 100. And it says, and Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth from them, from Ur of the Chaldees, to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. So here we have information as far as Abraham goes with his dad Terah, or Terah goes with Abraham into Canaan, but it says they came unto Haran. So they were going towards Canaan, right? And they came to Haran, but that's where Terah died. In verse 32 it says, in the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So he didn't make it to Canaan. And so we see more information about that in Acts 7. And we also remember, we talked about the fact that Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran, but they weren't triplets. And it talks about how Terah was 70 years old when he begat them. But that wasn't when he begat Abraham. And remember, we backtracked that. We figured out how old he was, but then how old he was when he left. And so we found out that Terah was actually 130 years old before he had Abraham. But go to Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. And we'll talk about this, obviously, when we get into chapter 12, about Abraham coming, being called out of the Ur of the Chaldees and all this stuff, and when we get more into his story. But we see that his dad didn't go all the way. And who was called? Well, God appeared to Abraham, we see here, not to his dad. But his dad was going along with them, but they stopped in Haran and didn't go any further. And Abraham stopped there until his dad died. So basically, it's kind of like he was being held back. And so in verse 2 of Acts chapter 7, this is Stephen's sermon. He's starting off. And it says, and he said, men and brethren and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Charan. Now, Charan is just another way of saying Haran. It's just different spelling. And so we see in Acts chapter 7 that when did God appear unto Abraham? It was before he came out of Mesopotamia. So when you go to chapter 12, when it says, he says, get thee out of thy country and away from thy kindred and go into another land, right? That when he said that to him, when he appeared unto him, he was still in Ur of the Chaldees. He was still in Mesopotamia. And he hadn't got to even Haran yet, where his dad dies. And so it's interesting because we know that the scripture before preached the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall the nations of the earth be blessed. And so we know that was the gospel to Abraham. When was that preached to him? Before he even left Mesopotamia. And so, and it gives us a little more information, because in verse 3 there it says, and said unto him, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. So that's in chapter 12 that's said. So we know that was said before he came out of Ur of the Chaldees. When you look at chapter 12, you don't really see that yet. But in verse 4 it says, then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Charan, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. So we see that basically he was starting to go, but his family was holding him back. And this is something, just a thought, as far as the fact that, you remember when Jesus was talking about a man taking hold of a plow, and looking back is not worthy of the kingdom of God. And you think about the fact that, well, let me bury my dad, kind of thing. And he said, let the dead bury the dead. And so it's not, when you got to look at those situations when Jesus is talking about that, he's talking about situations where it's keeping you from doing the work of God, right? God he's not calling all of us to just sell everything we have and just basically live in a monastery somewhere, okay? What that's talking about is the fact that, hey, if your family, if that's holding you back from going soul winning, if that's holding you back from going to church, if that's holding you back from doing anything, if your family's holding you back, you need to just go and forsake that, forsake what's holding you back. But Abraham here, it looks like he was holding on. Basically his dad didn't want to go into Canaan, and he was lingering in Haran, and he died there. Okay, and once his dad died, then he went. Okay, so we got to think about that, the fact that your family can hold you back. And I can think about this a lot when it comes to people just getting saved. People get saved and they want to do great things for God, and they're getting excited about the things of God, and their family is holding them back. Their family thinks they're in a cult. Their family's trying to put a wet blanket on it, and they're trying to hold them back from doing the work of God. And so this is where, you think of, it happened to Abraham, the friend of God. And we know that Abraham, was a great man of God, but even him, when it comes to obeying God, he was kind of held back a little bit before he finally did it. And so, it's a testament to our lives and the fact that we need to constantly be reminding ourselves not to let things get in our way. Now, obviously, you need to take care of your family. If you're a husband, you need to take care of your family. And if you're not taking care of your family and you're forsaking your wife and your kids, then you're not right with God, okay? That's just simple truth. I mean, you got to take care of but with your dad, with Abraham, he was married. You leave father and mother and cleave unto your wife. It's not like he had to obey what his dad was saying. If God told him to go into another country, he needed to go whether his dad would go or not. Does that make sense? And so if you're a child and you're under your parents' authority, and obviously you need to do what they tell you to do, okay? But in this case, there's a lot of people that are like that their family, they're like, oh, well, my family, they're going to think this, they're going to think that. Well, what's more important? What God thinks or what you think? I don't seek to please men. For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. So you got to think about what pleases God. If God tells you to do something, you literally, if God told me to jump, I want to be in the mindset that I'm jumping as he says it, and then I'm saying how high as I'm jumping. Right? Because if God commands to do it, there's no question of whether you should do it. It's just, I need to do this, and maybe I'll get some more information as it goes on. And so when God said to go out of the country, you should be like packing the bags, get there as soon as you can. But obviously, that didn't happen exactly the way he planned. But hopefully that makes sense with Babel. There's not a whole lot of information on that. I mean, you think about that story. It's a fascinating story with the Tower of Babel. But as you saw, I mean, it was just like a little portion of that chapter where we get that story about the Tower of Babel. But it's interesting how that comes full circle. Everybody was all congregated to one place, one city, and then from there, history goes on and is going to come full circle back to that. And then God's going to destroy it. He scattered them once, and guess what? He's going to completely demolish it the next time. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for tonight. Thank you for everybody that came out. And Lord, just pray that you be with us as we go home. Give us safety in our travels. And help us with our work week. Help us to get everything we need to get done at work. Help us to provide for our families. And Lord, we just thank you for your word. And thank you that you loved us and that you died on the cross for us. Lord, we love you and pray else in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.